I'm Ayhan Akhtar from Istanbul Bilgi University. I will be chairing this panel, which is our last panel, and the last panel of the beautiful conference. I don't know about you, but I learned a lot in the last 2 days. And I would like to thank to Ranting Foundation and especially Nayat for putting all these magnificent people together, and I'm very happy to meet most of them. Okay, in this panel we are dealing with the perpetrators. Dealing with perpetrators means that you have to deal with the problem. You have to deal with the event. You have to deal with the genocide, or as Mark Mazower calls it, dirty G word. He used it for the Turkish context, you know. And for that reason, dealing with perpetrators is also facing history, is also, you know, starting to discuss it. This morning, Andrea Petru from Hungary made a beautiful presentation, and she said memory politics serve as an ideology of illiberal state. And she also added, EU's memory politics mantra, never again, is not valid anymore. Andrea's paper was excellent. If I have the Word copy of it, I can use the find and replace command in Word. For example, I can take Orban and convert it to Erdogan. I can take Fidesz and convert it to AKP. From Poland to Turkey, and I would have a reasonably nicely written paper on Turkey. I really felt very much at home in your paper, I must admit. Facing history and dealing perpetrators has to be an ongoing process. I'm old enough to remember old days. In the 1990s, I used to work in a state university, and in every 2 months, we used to receive official letters from Higher Education Council, which is located in Ankara, coordinating all the universities. Why don't you sit down and write a monograph or do research on unsubstantiated Armenian lies? We used to throw these things to the dustbin, but that kind of atmosphere stopped us doing anything. After 2002, Turkey lived a kind of a decade of relative democratization. A decade, from 2002 to 2012. And this was the first 10 years of Erdogan's rule. And things were becoming softer, the atmosphere has changed, and in 2005 we organized an Armenian conference. You know, the official title was Ottoman Armenians in the Last Decade of the Empire, type of thing. 1908, 1918. And this conference was cancelled by court decisions twice. And while we were organizing the conference, we were under attack of Turkish fascists from right and left. And in the conference day, I remember at Bilgi University, my university, they were throwing eggs, and the Turkish policemen were trying to protect us. And this was branded by the Turkish press as genocide conference. And one of the reasons for court decision was we did not invite retired colonels or Ankara history professors who were denialists. After that, you know, something of a miracle happened. Pandora's box opened. Everybody started to talk about Armenian genocide. For example, you take a taxi from here, you want to go to the other side, it takes at least 50 minutes, and the driver looks at you and says, what do? You say, professor. What do you teach? Sociology, history. And he says, elder brother, did we massacre the Armenians? Ermenileri kestik mi? And this was the usual conversation, and we thought that this is beautiful. People are talking about it. And the driver, I remember one from Mardin, southeast Turkey, he was telling me how the Armenian population of his village were massacred and put to a well, and poor souls cried and so on for 5 days, and they died. I mean, he heard the story from his grandfather. You know, we were very optimistic. You know, we knew what the perpetrator is. And at the end also, Andrea today said, there is unbelievable research going on Holocaust, but ignorance is increasing geometrically. Same thing is happening in here. I mean, from 2005 to 2015, in 10 years, everything related to Armenian genocide was translated in Turkish. Original research came out, but I think Mr. Erdogan recognized the zeitgeist of the period, the zamanın ruhu in Turkish, and after 2012, he moved to a different direction. You call it illiberal democracy. And then, after that, I'm asking to my colleagues, some of them are here, if we want to make another Armenian conference, can we do it now? I have doubts. Even the organization committee cannot come together, as far as I see. Some of them are working for the palace. You know, therefore, knowing the perpetrator is a very touchy business, and it's not a process when you have completed it, it's over. No, it has to be done continuously. And this is an extremely tiring process. In order to go on with the two important memory places, our first panelist is Hans Christian Jasch. He's a lawyer and he's a legal historian. And he's going to talk about Wannsee residence, Wannsee house, close to Berlin, between Berlin and Potsdam. Dr. Hans Christian Jasch is a lawyer and legal historian by training, and he holds a PhD in legal history from Humboldt University in Berlin. And he was appointed as the director of Memorial and Educational Site House of Wannsee Conference in May 2014. He published an important book in 2012 on the Nazi State Secretary Wilhelm Stuckart, who represented the Ministry of Interior at the Wannsee Conference. And he's also working on the methods of countering right-wing extremist hate crime and terrorism. Dr. Jasch is an important expert on these matters. And he co-authored books on the participants of Wannsee Conference, on Nuremberg laws and public administration and the Holocaust during the 40s. Okay, and floor is yours, Dr. Jasch, and it's going to be 20 minutes, and I'll show you yellow card and a red card in the process.
Well, thank you very much for these friendly words of welcome, and particular thanks again to Nayat and the Rand Dink Foundation for making this possible, for approaching me. My first contact with the Rand Dink Foundation was in 2015 when I was in Istanbul, and then the situation was still quite different. It was before summer 2015, and it's amazing how much things have changed since then, and I'm grateful for you that you also brought us back to the situation here in Turkey. I had the impression during our discussions that Turkey was like the elephant in the room in some of the issues we were discussing here. So thank you very much. Who of you has been to Vanse? I know there's a big Van lake in Turkey. Oh, there's some of you have been there. Okay. Well, I think some of you might share the impressions which I would like to share with you. This is a picture of Vanse when you enter from the road. It's a clay-plastered facade, broken only by the window ledges and a few limestone pilasters. It's a park-like garden, and it reminds a little bit of the castle of Sanssouci, which is in Potsdam, where, by the way, also the Lepsius house is situated. We saw the mentioning of Lepsius in your presentation. It's actually one of our partner organizations. The striking thing about Vanse is that it is a beautiful location, especially in summer. It's a beautiful park. There is the lake. You can see on the other side of the lake there is a big lido, which was built in Bauhaus style in 1930, when the Vanse was opened up to the working masses. Before, it had been a rather affluent neighborhood where the wealthy people basically stayed to themselves, and then a social democrat member of the magistrate of Berlin, who happened to be Jewish, who happened to commit suicide in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, constructed the big lido on the other side, giving the Vanse to the masses of Berlin. And this lido was there also when the conference took place. There were no bases as the conference took place on the 20th of January during a very cold winter in 1942. You have to imagine that this place is part of a crime scene. It's a place where not a decision has been taken, but where an important meeting of senior officials of the German administration took place on the 20th of January 1942 with one single item on the agenda, the so-called final solution of the Jewish question. So you have to imagine the paragon in the case of the Armenian genocide would be a location where the Turkish cabinet with Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha, who both went to Berlin after the First World War, would meet in order to discuss the modalities of the genocide. Again, it was not a place where the decision was taken, as had been believed after the war for a long time due to the way how the Wannsee Conference was processed in Nuremberg. Speaking of authenticity, this is a big problem for us because people who come to Wannsee expect authenticity. The building is still there. It looked different in 1940, but we know very little about what happened in this house since 1940, when the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the main security office of the Reich, acquired the house from a wealthy millionaire who had fallen in disgrace. He had started to embezzle money. He ended up in prison in 1940, and he sold the house from prison to the SS and police, and became a guest house for the police. We know that also foreign police officers would stay here. We have an account from a Swedish police officer who stayed here in May 1942 and later sends a report which he shares with the British ambassador in Stockholm, where he actually describes how nicely he had been received in Berlin and the amenities of this house by the lake. Wannsee is not a concentration camp site. It's not a murder site. We know that the gardens of the villa had been tended by Jewish forced laborers until spring 1943, until the so-called Fabrikaktion, when the last remaining Jewish forced laborers were deported and were later replaced by forced laborers from the east. We actually managed to interview one survivor who, after the war, also came back to Berlin as a displaced person, was in Schlachtensee, which is in the immediate vicinity of the Wannsee, and later emigrated to New Zealand, and who was able to testify on this. giving us the idea that during the Wannsee conference, the catering for the participants was actually made by Jewish slave laborers who were working in the kitchen of the house. So basically, the big challenge which we are facing today is to explain what has happened in this house. And what has happened in this house is a rather ephemeral event. It's a 90-minute meeting, of which the only thing which we have left are minutes, 15 pages of minutes, written by Adolf Eichmann in conjunction with his boss Reinhard Heydrich, which were retrieved in the archives of the Foreign Office in 1947 and were used in the Nuremberg successor trials. It was a particularly important piece of evidence in the trial against the German Foreign Office and other ministries, which started in 1947, lasted until 1949. The main culprit of this trial was Ernst von Weizsäcker, the state secretary in the Foreign Office. I will just show you the main document, or this is one page of this main document. This is a very sober list with numbers. Yeah, this is the perspective of the perpetrators. These are the victims which have been anonymized. Yeah? They have been reduced to mere numbers. You see the entire European continent is basically here. Poland and Luxembourg are not mentioned because they have already been integrated into the Reich or into the occupied territories. But you see, for example, that Turkey is mentioned. However, it's only the European part of Turkey which was to be included in the final solution of the Jewish question, which according to Heydrich's orders, which he had received from Göring in summer 1941, would address the issue of solving the Jewish question in the European sphere of influence of Nazi Germany. This rather sober document already testifies to an ongoing genocide. The genocide didn't start on the 20th of January 1942 with the Wannsee Conference. It basically starts with the beginning of the war, with the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939. Already in this context, the first massacres took place, massacres against Jewish and Christian Poles. The ghettoization starts already in autumn 1939, spring 1940. So we have a dynamic of genocide with a rising death toll. And you can see it in the numbers here. For example, if you go up there, you see Estland, which is Estonia in English, which is already Judenfrei. Judenfrei meaning free of Jews. So the entire Jewish population of Estonia, which was comparatively small, had already been murdered by the Einsatzgruppe A, by a police unit which was operating in the Baltic countries. If you go further down to Latvia, Lettland in German, you see it's only 3,500 Jews left. This is less than a tenth of Latvia's pre-war Jewish population. Similarly, the case in Lithuania. In order to look at the perpetrators, now we have in Wannsee, and I know from a gender perspective this is rather dissatisfying because it's only men, 15 men who were present at the Wannsee conference, even though we found out that most likely there was a secretary who was assisting Eichmann, Frau Werlemann, who after the war was actually questioned about her role as a secretary and was very successful in actually clouding over what happened in Wannsee and denying what happened there. Most of these 15 men are probably not familiar to you. This is not the top level of the Nazi government. Yeah? This is not Hitler, this is not Göring, this is not Himmler who is present at the conference. The most well-known people... no. Well, I will try to... well, you see Heydrich there in the top. You see, of course, Eichmann. They are both framed by two leading police officials, Rudolf Lange, a young lawyer who was in charge of killing. No, it's working? Oh yeah, this is Lange. Heydrich Eichmann, this is Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo. This is Otto Hofmann, the head of the SS Race and Settlement Office, responsible for the Germanization of the occupied territories and also for keeping a register about so-called half-Jews. They were using very modern technology for the time, the Hollerith-Maschine, which was an IBM pre-computer system. This is Eberhard Schöngard, senior policeman for occupied Poland. And these are the guys from the civil administration. This is the party ministry, the Parteikanzlei. This is the Reichskanzlei, the central, well, basically the predecessor of our chancellery today. This is the ministry, well, this is the government in the general government. So in Krakow, he's the right hand of the viceroy of Hitler in Krakow. This is a state secretary from the Ministry of the Occupied Territories, a sort of colonial ministry which had been established for the occupied Soviet Union. This is one of his director generals responsible for minority issues in the occupied territories. This is a representative from the economic administration, Mr. Neumann, who later left the civil service and worked for the Salzgitter company, for the steel company. This is Martin Luther, one of the few people who didn't have a baccalaureate at the Wannsee Conference, because out of these 15 men, 10 were trained lawyers like myself. Most of them had PhDs. Many of them had studied abroad. For example, in the case of Leibrand, he had been born in Odessa in a family of German origin, had went to gymnasium in Dorpat, what is today Estonia. Then went fled to Berlin from the October Revolution, had a Rhodes Scholarship to study in the US, in Britain, and became a very well-respected scientist for minority questions and minority issues. This is Wilhelm Stuckert from the Ministry of Interior, who had been preparing the legal framework in which the genocide took place. Jennifer had already spoken about the racial legislation of the Reich, which singled out the Jews from the minority population. And this is somebody who might be more familiar to you, because this is Roland Freisler, who's not so well known as a Secretary of State in the Ministry of Justice, but he was president of the People's Court, which beheaded the conspirators against Hitler after the 20th of July 1944. When we look at the host of the conference, Reinhard Heydrich, there is a certain gender dimension to it, because he had been a rather apolitical figure. He had been a naval officer in the more or less demilitarized Navy in the interwar years. He had been discharged dishonorably from the Navy because he had made a marriage promise, which he didn't keep. And he got married to Mrs. von Osten, who was a stern National Socialist and actually pushed him, or we would say today radicalized him into National Socialism. She basically encouraged him to join the SS, and he presented himself to become an intelligence officer to Himmler, even though he had nothing to do with intelligence. He was responsible in the Navy for signaling. But this seemed to be enough for Himmler to trust him with the creation of the party intelligence service. Does this move on? No. This is Wilhelm Stuckert. Wilhelm Stuckert comes from very humble background, from a background in which he would never have been able to go to law school if the First World War wouldn't have finished in the way it did finish, and if the Weimar Republic wasn't established. He owed his career to the democratization of German society after 1918 and to the establishment of the Republic. He wasn't grateful for this. Already when going to gymnasium, to secondary school, he joined the DNVP, the right-wing national party, which was a partner of the NSDAP later on. And he became a secret member of the Nazi party in 1930 because he didn't want to endanger his career as a judge. He was a brilliant lawyer, had 2 excellent state exams, worked in a big Jewish law firm in Wiesbaden, apparently had a love affair with the daughter of one of the partners, helped writing her PhD as well while he was writing his own. But this was no hindrance for him to join the civil service in 1933, immediately after the Nazis came to power. And at the age of 31, he was appointed as general director in the Ministry of Education and Science. And he's the guy who basically signs the documents by which people like Einstein lose their Venia Legendi in Germany. He's responsible for the de-Judaization, as the Nazis called it, of the Prussian universities and schools. And in 1935, he moves on to the Ministry of Interior. Back to Wannsee. What happened in Wannsee? I was sometimes marveling about the stories you told from Lebanon, for example, from Beirut, about the El Barakat house. The history of Wannsee is a history of forgetting and denying, basically, for a long time. This is a picture from the mid-1950s. The Wannsee villa was handed to the city of Berlin immediately after the war by the Allies. It was first used by Allied soldiers, was then given to the city of Berlin, rented out to the Social Democrat Party as a convention home, and was then used by the city of Berlin as a recreation home for kids from the inner city, from Neukölln, which wasn't such a chic neighborhood then, but was still really working class neighborhood. This is Eichmann in color. Yeah, this changes it all because we tend to imagine these perpetrators in black and white and in uniform. This is Eichmann in Jerusalem, the trial starting after his abduction in 1960, a trial which received a lot of coverage also in Germany because the big underlying question was, why didn't Germany ask for Eichmann's extradition? This would have been possible. Eichmann manifested himself to the German embassy. He was working for Daimler-Benz in Buenos Aires after the war. He had managed to flee to Argentina with the help of the Vatican, basically, on the so-called red lines. The Eichmann trial also inspired another person, and this is, I think, very important if we speak about agents of memory. This is Yosef Wolff. Yosef Wolff is a survivor of the Auschwitz-Monowitz camp. His family is from Chemnitz and Krakow. He was born in Chemnitz, grew up in Krakow. He went to a yeshiva, so he never had a formal education as a historian, which became a problem later on. And he was a member of the Polish Jewish Historical Commission, which was established after Poland was gradually liberated after the war. He was among the people who unearthed the Ringelblum archives, which were hidden under the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, who edited documents, who followed the first trials in Krakow. He fled Poland in 1947 after the pogroms in Kielce and Krakow. He first went to Stockholm, then to Paris, and then decided to settle in Berlin, the Lion's Den. And he made it his mission to educate the Germans about the Holocaust and about the societal involvement in the Holocaust. He published 13 books with different titles called The Third Reich and Its Servants, The Third Reich and Its Generals, The Third Reich and Its Civil Servants, The Third Reich and Its Artists. Yeah, this was not very popular in the 1950s, as you can imagine. He was publishing documents, photos of many people who had managed to blend into post-war society again. And he started an initiative to convert Wannsee into a research center. His idea was that Wannsee should become a storage for documents on the Holocaust and for research on the Holocaust, at a time when many of these perpetrators were still alive and were around. This initiative failed miserably. The then Social Democrat mayor of Berlin, Schütz, was afraid that he would lose votes if the Wannsee home would not longer serve the purpose as a recreation home for kids. Basically, Yosef Wolff committed suicide in 1974, leaving a very bitter letter to his son where he said, "You can document yourself to death in Germany. The perpetrators will still go on watering flowers in their little gardens." Yeah, this was his resume. In Germany, it's interesting, we always had a sting in our back. This was East Germany. Even though there was also a big continuity issue in East Germany, the East Germans were quite keen on portraying themselves as the better German state on German soil, and basically as showing Bonn or the Bonn Republic as the Nazi stronghold. And this is a picture of Hans-Josef Maria Globke. He was actually the right hand of Stuckart. He was responsible for nationality issues in the Reichsministry of Interior, and he became Adenauer's chief of staff in 1952. He was tried in absence in the GDR in 1960 because the GDR was angry that their top lawyer was not admitted at the Eichmann trial. The Knesset changed the law. And this had a big impact also on the situation in West Germany and on the way how the past was dealt with. I have to be very conscious of time. Maybe I will finish with this. This is a plaque which was installed at the facade of the house in 1982, 40 years after the Wannsee Conference. And it says in this house, in January 1942, the infamous Wannsee Conference took place in memory to our Jewish co-citizens who died through National Socialist violent rule. This doesn't speak about perpetrators. This sort of mentions the Holocaust as a machine, yeah, as a catastrophe which came upon people. And this was quite the typical way how to portray this. As I have to, yeah, one more. I think this is an interesting story. I already mentioned Ernst von Weizsäcker. Here you see him as a culprit in Nuremberg. I think this is maybe also a nice introduction to your presentation. And this is another nice picture. This is Papa Weizsäcker with son Weizsäcker. Son Weizsäcker, who later became our federal president, Richard von Weizsäcker, who was a law student in Nuremberg and was part of the defense council of his father. And it was son Weizsäcker who became mayor of Berlin in the 1980s, and in 1982 organized the first official commemoration in Wannsee, which was very much also a family matter, because Papa Weizsäcker had been one of the people to whom Martin Luther was reporting about the Wannsee Conference. Papa Weizsäcker was condemned on the basis of documents from the Foreign Office, where he had actually written in red ink. Yeah, this was the color of the state secretary. In Germany, everything is nicely organized. I have no reservations to raise against the evacuation. This was the typical term which was used for the deportation of Jews, yeah, to their murder camps in this matter. Yeah, so this was, you could show he knew what was happening. He was very cautious in a very delicate way how he formulated this. I think I'll stop here. Maybe just one last thing, because Jennifer and I discussed this yesterday. What is the image we confront when we meet our visitors? It's the image of conspiracy. Yeah, surprisingly, it was very good publicity for us, this film, Conspiracy. It's a very questionable production, starring Shakespeare actors. Yeah? Kenneth Branagh, you might know, as Henry V, or as Richard II, I think. Stanley Tucci is playing in mafia films, usually is playing Eichmann, and Colin Firth, you know, might know from The King's Speech, he's playing Stuckart in this film. This is a dramatization of the Wannsee Conference. This is another picture from another film from the 1980s, a German film, which is more boring, but closer to the sources. The problem is really to convey a rather boring event, such an interministerial meeting, with such a monstrous objective, killing 11 million people on the entire European continent, and this is what we are struggling with. Thank you very much for your attention.